Hello, my name is Earl Bushy. You've been watching photos of my favorite Mokume Gane pattern. I make sculpture and occasional outlet plate to test alloy colors. I want to show you a flexible and versatile way to pattern Mokume Gane. I call it a cross pattern and it's my favorite. As you know, Mokume Gane means wood grain metal in Japanese, and it's an old-time Japanese process of making decorative metal laminate. In our process, which is pretty standard procedure, we clean the plates of different alloys, stack them in order, and bolt them between two steel plates. Note the slots that allow us to easily remove the bolts. Also, the thick copper core that we add. If we need to, we can store them indefinitely in a vacuum. We press the plates under 20 tons of pressure in a hydraulic press. Then we heat them to fusing temperature in a gas forge. When still hot, we return to the press and squeeze the billet to consolidate the bonds and also to remove the bolts. Sometimes it gets exciting when we do a large hot billet. Here you see Jerry moving a future copper heatsink to the press and Jean pressing it to free up the bolts. After it cools, we clean up the billet and then we anneal it. Now we can begin the forging. After each round of careful forging, the billet is annealed. This forging and annealing process is repeated many times. Annealing can be done in an easily built oven or with a torch. It truly takes hours to forge this billet into a finished sheet for patterning. You see some here. I want to show you how this pattern works by using layers of clay. First, the layers. I cut down 3 layers here. In the billet, I cut many parallel channels. The flattening process pushes high areas down, but it also lets the channels fill with raised up lower layers. Now, I cut down again as deep as the 3rd layer. After flattening, you can see the lower contrasting red layer exposed, mostly at the intersections. It forms this bullseye or dot in a regular pattern. Let me show you how to cut this in metal. This is a close-up of my chiseling. You will notice that I'm cutting down through 3 layers, just like in the clay demonstration. I'll patinate this so we can get a better view. Now let's look at a clip of the billet before it was forged into this sheet. This is the actual billet that we are patterning. There's 4 layers of silver plus 1 on the left, which will become the bottom. Notice that the 3rd layer is extra thick silver. We add a thick core of copper like you saw in the fusing photos to add strength and mass to the thin layers that we pattern. Here is a diagram of this billet from my notebook. That extra thick 3rd layer of silver is actually 2 fused layers of fine silver. That's that little F superscript. The KU on the 2nd layer down tells me that I use Kuramido alloy here. It'll patinate really black or dark brown and make a good contrast next to the silver. Let's continue patterning. I'm making a series of parallel channels just like in the clay, but more extensive. I'm cutting down slowly to keep the bottom of the channel in that 3rd layer. I don't want to go through it. It's not really a tragedy if I do. Oop, there I go. We will see more of this darker layer that's peeking out at us on the next series of crossing channels. This is another parallel channel. A little tip here. Notice that in cleaning up, I ease into the side of the channel a bit. Cutting into the side of the channel keeps the chisel from cutting too deep in the center. And I've been using Baldwin's patina here. This is a photo of the bottom of the chisels that I use. Sometimes flattening the center curve is another way to control the depth by flattening the bottom of the cut. Now I've taken the chiseled piece off of my patterning block, I'm going to flatten out those channels. I'm going to use a rounded faced hammer with very light blows. My idea is to flatten out the high areas at the same time as I let the metal flow into those channels. Many light blows let the metal flow without deforming the rest of the billet below it. Now you can see the metal rising up in the channels. I watch for this in the reflected light. The last step is to smooth out those rounded hammer marks with a flat-faced hammer, like in this clip from a later forging. Notice that I'm forging very lightly. I anneal the piece, then pickle. Back on the patterning bench, I've begun cutting the crossing channels. You can see the new pattern emerging. In this demonstration, I'm keeping the bottom of those new channels at that third layer, and little spots like bullseyes happen where the lower layers have risen up to that third layer level where I cut across them. I'm refining the bullseyes, taking a peek at those lower layers. There's lots of interest here. One variation is to cut the crossing channels at an angle. I'm again refining those interesting eye shapes. This variation leaves oval shapes in the layers. Here, with a better focus after cutting the second channel, you can see how the third layer, that's the silver, surrounds the shapes that have emerged. This type of patterning, stopping at a certain depth, isn't easy. That's the bad news. It does give a result that I think is worth the trouble. But the good news is this type of patterning works at any depth. What happens if you cut the crossing channels without forging anything flat? Quick, fast. I tried it, and the little pyramids between the crossing cuts just popped off. It was a total mess. But there might be something there, so give it a try if you want. Again, we gently forge the channels flat with the rounded hammer. We lightly flatten the result, and then anneal it. And last, we pickle. Let's patina this sample in rock show for an hour or so. Meantime, this is what we did. Number 1, after planing the billet and forging it down into sheet, I cut the parallel channels. And number 2, I like to cut down to one particular layer. And don't forget to anneal. And number 3, I cut the crossing channels, refine the crossing spots, then forge the layers flat. Here's where you can clean up any problem areas. And 4, I finish the piece last. However, you can form the piece before you cut any pattern. It's another way to pattern a piece and is well worth looking into. Here's what I got. This is a pretty good example of the crossing pattern and a good start. Now let's carefully look at some pieces. Most of these channels end at the reddish copper layer. They're wide, giving the piece an overall warm hue. There's a silver layer below that and 2 dark layers that add contrast where they're cut through at the bullseye shape. Believe it or not, this is the same billet. Here, the deep wide channels stop at the deep gray layers. The bullseye shapes dive into the black or dark layers. A few even cut into the red copper core. This conch shell has a silver surface with curving channels meeting at acute angles. The crossing areas show a very deep copper red layer, which is a 6th layer down, and a hint of a dark layer below it. A work in progress. Curved channels through dark layers were forged flat, then later cut across with slow curving channels. We see the result, annealed and pickled before being formed into an abalone shell, and the finished shell. This is my usual procedure for patterning. Channels can be tight and dense, like on these 2 Japanese tsubas, or sparse on a large field. Thank you for watching. I hope you like this idea. Mokume Gane patterning is as unique as a fingerprint. Give it a try.